Hello, friends. Today we'll talk about one of humanity's most terrifying enemies, syphilis. Fortunately, many of you have probably never even heard of this dreadful disease. But just a few decades ago, and especially in the era before the invention of rubber contraceptives, syphilis was a true scourge. Well, one of many, to be precise. Deadly diseases were rampant throughout history. Some of the worst ones significantly reduced the population of Europe. And not just Europe, but the entire world. Venereal diseases, including syphilis, were among them, but we'll get to that later. Tuberculosis was another terrifying affliction, spreading rapidly in overcrowded cities across Europe and Asia. For centuries, perhaps even millennia, it claimed millions of lives every year. Then there was smallpox, whose epidemics periodically devastated entire regions. The plague, both bubonic and other forms, followed. Cholera, the scourge of the Middle East and other hot climates, was another. These were some of the most infamous killers of humanity, though there were many more. But let's return to America. The year is 1492. Christopher Columbus has just discovered the New World, what would later be called America. The indigenous people, still living in a Stone Age society, stared in awe at the bearded white men arriving on their shores. This marked the beginning of the conquistador era, the age of conquest. The native people soon realized that these new arrivals were not mere visitors but conquerors, seeking to impose their rule. In old Soviet textbooks, the conquest of the Americas was often described in an unconvincing way, claiming that the conquistadors slaughtered the natives by the hundreds of thousands or even millions. But how could that be? And more importantly, why? Would the Spaniards really chase indigenous people across the Caribbean islands with halberds, swords, and war dogs? Or pursue them through the mountains and plains of Mexico? The natives numbered in the millions, while the Spanish invaders were just a tiny handful. In reality, the indigenous population could have easily overwhelmed the conquistadors with sheer numbers. But things turned out to be much simpler. As a subjective historian who follows the principles of Occam's razor, the idea that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one, I believe that the conquistadors did not systematically exterminate the natives. They needed subjects for the Spanish Empire, not piles of corpses. In fact, the Spanish had little racial prejudice, at least by today's standards. Most of the conquistadors were young, unmarried men, and many took native women as wives, after baptizing them, of course. Spanish migration to the Americas was overwhelmingly male, with very few Spanish women crossing the Atlantic. So what caused the catastrophic decline in the indigenous population? The primary culprit was smallpox. This disease paved the way for the conquistadors' dominance. Native Americans, who had no domesticated animals, had never been exposed to the zoonotic diseases that plagued Europeans. Lacking any immunity, they were defenseless. Smallpox swept through the continent years before the Spanish even reached many areas. Many Spaniards bore scars from previous smallpox infections, giving them some resistance. But the natives, in turn, had their own devastating counterattack, one that struck swiftly and brutally. Just 2 years after Columbus's first voyage, an outbreak of a new and terrifying disease erupted in the army of King Charles VIII of France, which was then fighting in Italy. Some of his soldiers had previously sailed with Columbus. The war had to be abandoned, and as the army fled in panic, it carried the disease across Europe. Thus began the march of syphilis. By 1512, it had reached Japan, meaning that in just over a decade, around the same time smallpox was ravaging the Americas, syphilis had spread across the entire Old World. In Western Europe alone, syphilis claimed an estimated 5 million lives in its early years. The death toll in other regions remains unknown, but it was likely in the millions as well. In the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Muscovite state, the disease was called the French disease, or simply French. It was even mentioned in the Domostroi, a 16th century Russian household guide. There was no effective treatment at the time. Authorities attempted to control the spread by regulating prostitution, establishing state-controlled brothels, enforcing quarantine measures, and isolating the infected. Though these efforts reduced the prevalence of syphilis, it continued to torment Europe until the 20th century. For example, in 1910, about 20% of soldiers in the Russian Imperial Army were infected. Only modern medicine eventually managed to subdue this horrific illness. When comparing the effects of epidemic diseases on Europe and the Americas, a grim parody emerges. Millions perished on both sides. This was the tragic outcome of first contact between civilizations. That's all for today, friends. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time.